So today I'm going to be talking about Google Tag Manager, but specifically enhanced e-commerce tracking implementations. I've worked on a number of them over the past year or so, so I'm going to try to share what I've learned, and the idea is that people on my team, some of the developers and some of the project managers can understand what's possible. So over the past year or so, I've done a number of implementations. The first major one I did was with the World Food Programme. We've also had some for our own kind of clients like ClickSergeant. Samaritans was a kind of standalone enhanced e-commerce implementation, again working with a kind of third-party developer, and we've done the same for Action for Children. The one I'm working on at the moment is for Chatham House. We did an implementation via Tag Manager 2, maybe 3 years ago, but it's now come time to kind of update it slightly. We've learned how to do it slightly better, so I'm kind of working on moving them from the old setup to the new setup. The aim of doing enhanced e-commerce tracking via, sorry, I should probably go back. We've got some meningitis now people in the room here, and I said to Caroline I would explain what Google Tag Manager was, first of all. It's basically a way of implementing third-party code on a website. So the typical way before Tag Manager was you would get a snippet of code from the tool, you would send it to your developer and say, please stick this on the page. And that was okay, but it means that you're relying on a developer in order to implement code. So if you've got some kind of tracking, marketing tracking you want to do yourself, you're always relying on a third party to help you out. So the idea with Google Tag Manager is you still have to ask a developer to implement it at the beginning, but after that, it gives you this kind of empty box that you can inject code into via a web interface. So it could be a Facebook tracking pixel. We use it a lot for our Google Analytics implementations, but you can also do slightly more complex things. It's basically a way to inject JavaScript into a website. So if you're conversing in JavaScript, you can do quite a lot of things in Google Tag Manager. But it's mainly used for basic marketing tracking like Google Analytics, Google AdWords, and so on. But I'm focusing specifically on how to track e-commerce within Google Analytics. So what you really want to get to is something like this. This is a screenshot from the World Food Programme's analytics implementation. And it shows over the past week or so the revenue they've generated from each of their different kind of donation products. So each of the products you see here are the different options you get when you make a donation. So you can donate to different programs. So you can see a kind of breakdown of the revenue they've got from it and the quantity and average price and so on. World Food Programme also wanted it because they wanted a better understanding of how their donation funnel works. So before enhanced e-commerce, the way to track a funnel in Google Analytics was to set up a goal with funnel steps. And I really don't like the report that produces. It's really confusing because you can often enter a funnel at different steps in the process. So it was really difficult for me to kind of parse which is the leaky part of the funnel, where are people dropping out. So for enhanced e-commerce, the implementation is slightly different. You work with a developer to kind of define what your funnel steps are, and then you just basically label them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And then within Google Analytics, you can translate that step 1 into a kind of more human-friendly name. So here we've got country, so you first of all have to say which country you're from. You choose the fund you're going to donate to, you give your donation amount, you enter your details, and then your payment details. So you can see the biggest drop-off is after that first step, going from selecting a country to selecting a fund. The nice thing about this report in Google Analytics is that you can segment it by various different dimensions. So here we've got the country segment selected, so you can see, for example, that loads of people from the US enter, but only 3% of them end up making a donation. And if you compare that to Canada, over half of the people that join the donation funnel from Canada donate. So that's kind of fits our stereotypes about how generous those two countries are. So that's kind of what you're aiming to get to with Google Tag Manager and enhanced e-commerce. You can implement enhanced e-commerce in the standard way of just having an on-page snippet, but Google Tag Manager gives you a little bit more flexibility in how it's done, and it also kind of lightens the load on the developer. We can do more of the setup as people in the digital marketing team. So there are two basic ways to implement enhanced e-commerce in Google Tag Manager. The kind of standard way is using what's called the data layer. And then the other option is using a custom JavaScript variable. So the data layer is a little bit like Google Tag Manager itself. It's a kind of empty box that you can inject information into. So this is information that's not displayed on a web page, but it's metadata about the page. So if you imagine on a donation confirmation page, things that you're pushed to the data layer includes the type of donation it was, how much it was, how many donations were made, and any other kind of details about the donation. So the data layer really needs to be done by the developer or whoever has built the kind of third-party donation tool, and that needs to appear on the confirmation page after a transaction has happened. And it's easier to implement in Google Tag Manager because there's a way you can set up your tag in Google Tag Manager to say, go to the data layer to find all the information you need. You do need to be careful that the data layer has to be formatted in the correct syntax for an e-commerce object, which I will show you shortly. And I've also discovered that when you are pushing that information into the data layer, it's easier to implement some of the tags if you also include a kind of custom event for a transaction and for the checkout event. So when you're going through the different funnel steps, because you can use that event to then fire your tags in Google Tag Manager. So the data layer is relatively easy to implement, but you do need developer resources, but it's slightly less flexible than the custom JavaScript variable option, and I'll show you that shortly. But that can be good if you have limited help from a developer. So for the Chatham House implementation, we're working with a kind of third-party developer for their kind of e-commerce platform. And it's easier for me to just write the custom JavaScript myself rather than having a kind of series of back and forth across the ticket. And it also lets you, if you realize there's a change you want to make to the implementation, it's often easier if you can do that via a custom JavaScript variable in Tag Manager rather than having to request that change from the developer. So in Google Tag Manager, there are two options you get when you enable e-commerce in your tag. The default option is to just use the data layer, but if you don't select that checkbox, you get the option to read the data from a variable. So this is where you have to write your own code within Tag Manager. And that kind of checking the box to enable enhanced e-commerce does the same thing as this require EC line does in the standard snippet. So here you've got, this would be a normal on-page snippet without Tag Manager for Google Analytics. And you've got the create line where you declare the property ID, so the Google Analytics account you want to send data to. There's then this extra line to just enable the plugin for e-commerce. And then the lines below that are declaring the information about the product. So that's normally what a developer would have had to do, kind of on-page coding. But we can now do all of that through Tag Manager. So here are two examples of what the data layer would look like. So as I mentioned, the data layer is kind of this empty object on the page. And what a data layer pushes is basically sending information into that empty box that you can then query with Google Tag Manager. And this is where the syntax becomes important. So I don't know if I suspect most of you are not conversant in JavaScript, but you can see there's an object, an e-commerce object that then has lots of kind of nested objects within that. So you can see we're declaring the currency code as British pounds. You then need to declare that a purchase has happened. And in order to be a valid purchase, you need a transaction ID. And then within that purchase, you can have multiple products. So this is our implementation for ClickSargent. And you can see here we've got two products. They both have the product name one-off donation, but we wanted a way to record gift aid separately from the main donation amount. So the way we're doing that is just by splitting that single transaction into two products. One is the original donation amount of £50, and then the other one is the 25% of gift aid on top of that. ClickSargent, we have a kind of hybrid approach. So we're both using the data layer for the stuff that happens within the Drupal e-commerce module. But then there are some things that we can't really control via Drupal, such as their PayPal donations. And all you get from PayPal is when you send the user back to a thank you page, you get a URL with a series of query parameters. And we can use Tag Manager to turn those query parameters into values that we can put into our object. So you can see that the syntax is relatively similar to the data layer push, but instead of pushing information into the data layer, we're just declaring a function, and then we're returning the result of that function at the end. And that's the kind of variable that we will be sending to Google Analytics via Google Tag Manager. So again, it has the same structure of currency code purchase with a transaction ID, and then this one is just a single product, a one-off donation, but we've got the ID as PayPal, so we can tell the difference between a one-off donation that's come via the main website and then one that's come via PayPal. I want to show you just how we've got a couple of the variables within this JavaScript variable. So when you've got the double curly brackets within Tag Manager, that means another variable that is set up within Tag Manager. So first of all, let me show you what the thank you page for a PayPal transaction looks like. So you can see here we've got a parameter TX, so that's the transaction ID. We've got ST for, I think that's status, so it's a completed transaction. And then AMT for the amount of the donation, and CC is the currency code. So we can turn those query parameters into variables that we can use in Tag Manager. I'll just have a quick look at those. So let's look at amount first of all. So this is a URL variable in Tag Manager, and it's of a component type query, and it's going to pull out the query key AMT. So if we look back at our thank you page URL, here's our AMT variable. So basically we're just going to pull out that £30 there. And if I look in our preview mode, I'll just close down the JavaScript module. So if I look at the variables here, we have a URL query for a PayPal amount, and we've got the string here of £30. And it's the same for the other queries that we pulled out. So we pulled out the currency code, the status, and also the transaction ID. And then if we actually look at the object for a PayPal donation, here we've got our e-commerce object, currency code GBP, we've got our purchase with transaction ID and the revenue, and here's our product. So that's how the transaction for PayPal is sent to Google Analytics.
Chris?
Yeah?
Can I just ask you a question about that? So, if someone had paid that donation on the left, which is £50 plus a £12.50 gift aid, you've been able to split out on, if someone had paid for that on PayPal, would it just show up as a single donation of £62.50?
PayPal for ClickSargent doesn't have the option of adding gift aid.
Oh, right, okay.
So in that case, it would just be the one-off amount. ClickSargent have a relatively simple implementation for PayPal donations. The stuff I did for Action for Children, PayPal is kind of more integrated into their donation workflow. So that would be treated just like any other donation you could have.
Okay.
You could have gift aid as a second product there. The thing I found is that every setup I work with is different, so there's no kind of template that you can use across all sites. You have to kind of customize it for every single setup.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. So when implementing enhanced e-commerce, it's worth planning ahead of time how you're going to go about it. And I found that it can be overwhelming if you just present a developer, or if you just look at the documentation yourself, because there are so many different things you can do with enhanced e-commerce. But I think it's usually smart to begin by tracking the purchases, because that's essentially the main piece of information you want to get out of it. And then once you've got that purchase tracking in place, you can then think about tracking the checkout steps, so the funnel leading up to the transaction. The problem with the way that you track funnels with enhanced e-commerce, because you're just numbering the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you have a different journey for different donation types, it means that step 2 could be, you know, entering your payment details for one of the options, but it might only be entering your address details on another. So you have to kind of think quite carefully about how you're going to do that. So for ClickSergeant, for example, we're only really tracking checkout steps for their one-off donations. We're not doing it for monthly donations or PayPal. I mentioned that enhanced e-commerce can give you a whole host of other data, not just the transaction. And it's really designed for shop-like experiences. So you can track what they call product impressions. So that could just be viewing a page of a single product in an e-commerce store. You can also track clicks on a particular product. So you might have a product listing page. You can track kind of interactions when someone clicks on a particular product. You can track views of product details. You can track when people add or remove items from a shopping cart. And there's also an ability to track promotions. So that could be from a discount code, as well as tracking refunds as well. But you're not simply limited to tracking kind of monetary activity. You can use the same template of dimensions and metrics to track content. And Seymour Hava, who's one of the Google Tag Manager gurus that we follow, he's done an implementation for tracking content. So you could have, as your funnel step, reading, you know, 25%, 50%, 75% of the way through an article. And then you can associate values with different interactions on your site that you want. There are 2 different versions of e-commerce. The standard one, which is the older one, only measures transactions. And that is quite good if it's a very simple process that you want to track. But the reason we often recommend going for enhanced e-commerce is because it gives you that option for the funnel steps. And you can also track those other product impressions and so on that I mentioned. One thing to watch out for is both of them use this concept of the data layer, but the syntax has changed between the standard version and the enhanced e-commerce version. So if you already have an enhanced e-commerce implementation, you can't simply switch it over to enhanced e-commerce. You need to reformat that data layer. But enhanced e-commerce does give you more data and gives you more flexibility about how you implement it. So I would recommend going that way. So those are all my slides. I think I might now show you some more of the implementations and what it looks like in Google Analytics. So here is the World Food Programme. And this is the slide that I showed in the presentation. So you can see we've got our checkout analysis, so basically the donation funnel. And you'll notice these labels here, country, fund, donation details, and so on. So that would be step 1, step 2, step 3. You can actually name them whatever you like within Google Analytics. So you do it under e-commerce settings, and then you basically just label here the name of each checkout step. The setup here is for Action for Children. So they have quite a well integrated donation process. And we've set it up relatively simply to track the difference between single and regular donations. But if you drill into single donations, you'll see that there are lots of different types of single donation that you can make. So we are separating out as two separate products, just the single donation, but also the amount they're raising from gift aid. But then they also have these kind of campaign sites that have their own donation process. So they name those products slightly differently. They're all grouped under the product name single donation. But then they just have this DM marker and they have various different labels for their other campaigns. There's also a product category that you can add, another dimension. So for Action for Children, they use this to collect the reason for donation. And then product brand, they're using to collect the payment methods, so you can see which payment methods are generating revenue for them. For ClickSergeant, they have their one-off donations, regular donations, and paying and fundraising. There's 3 different products. The product SKU or ID is the different ways of paying those donations. You can also add a secondary dimension, so we could look at the one-off fundraising, one-off donations, for example, so you can see how much came from the original donation, how much came from gift aid, and then how much came from PayPal donations. And again, they're using category to collect the reason for donation. And then finally, I wanted to show you the difference between an enhanced e-commerce setup and a standard one. So this is the DEC. They at the moment have a standard e-commerce. They did this for legacy reasons, so they were using an older BT donation platform that didn't support enhanced e-commerce. So they're at the moment on a standard setup, but I'm going to try and encourage them to upgrade to enhanced e-commerce. But you can see the reports they have are slightly more limited. You can just see product performance and transactions. There's no kind of checkout behavior you can see there. Does anyone have any questions?
Chris, I don't know if it's possible, but is there any way you could set up something and walk us through it in GTM?
I'm not going to set up something from scratch, but I'll certainly show you the setup we've done for ClickSergeant in more detail.
Okay, thank you.
So let's start with the basic Drupal commerce transaction. So there are 2 basic ways to fire the e-commerce data. You can either do it via a page view, but I recommend doing it via an event instead, so that you can be slightly more controlled in how you send that information. So let me just show you how that is set up. So you basically need a way to enable that enhanced e-commerce plugin. So you've got an event here that's firing with an event category of e-commerce and an action or transaction. And then we're enabling the e-commerce plugin here, and we're saying use the data layer. And then one thing to look out for is we are firing this tag with a basic custom event called transaction. So this is something that the developers added when they're doing the data layer push that sends all the information, including donation amount, transaction ID, and so on. They're also including a custom event called transaction. So that means that this tag will only fire when transactions happen. There's also a checkout process that we're tracking. So again, this is an event tag. Again, e-commerce is enabled, and we're using the data layer for that. And this time, the trigger is a custom event with the name of checkout. So again, that will be in the data layer at each step in the process. So I can actually just go through a donation on the staging site for ClickSergeant and show you that in action. So this is the donate page, which we're counting as the first step in the checkout process. And you'll see here an event called checkout has fired, and we're using that event to fire an event tag that's enabling the enhanced e-commerce plugin. We can also have a look at the data layer. So this is what the developer is pushing to the data layer. Here we've got an event with checkout and then a very simple e-commerce object that's basically just step one in the process. And if we check the JavaScript console, we'll see what information is actually being sent to analytics. Here we have an event with an action of checkout, and it's step one. And there we go. So if I move on to the next step in the process, I give a single gift of £75. This is step two in the donation process. So again, we've got our checkout event, and you can see in the data layer, it's declared as step two. We'll just fill in this form and continue on to step three. So again, here's our checkout event. In the data layer, we have step three. We're also starting to clear some other information about the donation, but this isn't as important until you get to the transaction page. So just pre-fill this form. Email field is required, okay. Confirm address. So I'm now being taken onto the test version of SagePay. This is outside the realm of what we can track within Tag Manager because we don't have any control over the coding for SagePay. This is essentially a bit of a black hole. We can only really control the Drupal pages. So I'm just going to fill in this form. I've done this hundreds of times, so I've got lots of predefined form fillers for me. So we can proceed to the next step. So here's the confirmation page. We can see that a transaction event has fired, and that's what we're using to enable our transaction tag. In the data layer, this is what the developer has pushed to the data layer, so we can see our transaction event. We've got our e-commerce object, the currency code, transaction ID, and the total revenue. It's recording the product name, so we've got two one-off donation products, and then a different ID for the donation and gift aid. We've got the price, and then the category is the reason for donation. I think because this is a staging setup, the reason I chose is not exactly the same as we can see here. And then if we just check the JavaScript console, we'll see that same information sent to Google Analytics. So we've got our e-commerce purchase action for two products for the one-off donation of £75 plus the gift aid of £18.75, and then the total revenue of £93.75. So that's all happening via the Drupal commerce module. But ClickSargent do also have the ability to donate via PayPal. But that only happens on mobile devices. So if I go to PayPal, I'm making this to mobile with. you can see there's a PayPal donate button there. So I'll just show you how we're tracking PayPal within Tag Manager. So again, we have an event, and this time is being triggered by a page view where the page path equals the page path for the confirmation page. And there's also using a URL query for completed. But this one is using a JavaScript variable to build the e-commerce object. So if we have a look at that variable, you can see here it's the function rather than the data layer push, and it's formatted in the correct way as an e-commerce object. And as I showed you earlier, it's got these URL query variables that are filling in transaction ID, revenue, and so on. Okay, does anyone have any other questions?
Chris, as a developer, what should I expect when you come to me saying I need you to do enhanced e-commerce tracking with GTM?
Okay. Basically, what I would need is this here, the data layer push. So either on the checkout pages in the funnel or on the preferably on the transaction page, that's the most important one. I would need you to extract from the payment system the details I need to build a valid object, so transaction ID, what the product was, what the product ID was, and so on. And it needs to be in that correct syntax, which you can see in the developer documentation. But then ideally, I also want you to add that custom event, so the event transaction, that will help me fire the tag that will send information to Google Analytics. So it depends on the setup. You could do that by scraping the page, but I imagine if you're dealing with a third-party payment system, there's probably a system of variables that you can use to output information either into the HTML or into the data layer. And it's better when it's kind of dynamic rather than kind of hacked with querying the DOM. And it seems to be more stable that way. Any other questions?
Thanks, Chris.
Chris,
Oh.
sorry. I just wondered what are the clients that we're doing this for using the data for? What type of activities are they following up with?
They're using it, for example, to track the performance of their different campaigns, so you can see which of their campaigns is driving the most revenue, which of their marketing channels, is it Facebook, is it Twitter, is it their email campaigns that are generating the revenue. They can also use it to try and fix any weaknesses in their donation process. So if they notice the dropout rate in one of the steps is particularly low, they can look at trying to fix that and maybe remove the form fields or change the order of the donation process. So it's not always, I don't think it's necessary to declare the reason for a donation within the donation process. You might want to do that after the transaction has occurred. So that's one of the things that you might want to experiment with if you can prove that that is a weakness in the donation funnel. But I find that quite a lot of our clients aren't actually tracking donations in this way. So it can actually just be a real boon to know how much revenue they're getting from their donation process.
Yeah. And are they ever approaching us or asking us for support in terms of redesigning those journeys to improve conversion, or are they doing it themselves?
ClickSergeant just have. Okay. So yeah.
I think also Action for Children are in the process of doing some testing. I think they have spoken to us about trying to optimize their donation flow. But it kind of makes sense to do the enhanced e-commerce implementation first, that you've got the data that you can then verify your tests with if you are going to be making changes.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.